Lady Cassandra Hartwell had perfected the art of being useful without being noticed. At Lady Pemberton's garden party on a warm June afternoon in 1848, she stood near the refreshment table, quietly reorganizing the chaos that had erupted when a clumsy footman had knocked over an entire tray of glasses. "No, no," she murmured to the flustered young man. "Stack them by size first, then we can distribute them more efficiently. And someone should fetch more lemonade before the guests notice we're running low." She worked quickly, her worn gloves moving with practiced efficiency as she restored order to the disaster. No one thanked her. She hadn't expected them to. Ladies of her diminished status were expected to make themselves helpful at such events, contributing labour in lieu of the generous donations they could no longer afford. Cassandra, Cass, to her few remaining friends, had attended Lady Pemberton's annual garden party for 8 years running. The first time, at 18, she'd worn a beautiful new gown and her mother's pearls, dancing and laughing without a care beyond which gentlemen might ask for the next waltz. That had been before her father's sudden death 3 years ago, before the discovery that he'd spent the family's entire fortune on experimental medical treatments for her mother's worsening lung condition, treatments that hadn't worked, before they'd been forced to sell the London house, the country estate, every piece of jewellery except her mother's wedding ring. Now, at 26, Cass wore a dress that was 5 years old and had been turned twice to hide the worst of the wear. The paste pearls at her throat were a poor imitation of the genuine Hartwell pearls her grandmother had been famous for wearing. Those had been sold 2 years ago to pay for her mother's physician. Her gloves had been turned so many times that the original stitching showed faintly at the seams, though she'd disguised it as best she could with careful pressing. She attended these events not for pleasure, but because maintaining even a threadbare connection to society was necessary. Her younger brother Thomas needed those connections to secure a decent position somewhere, and her mother, still ill, still requiring expensive care that Cass somehow had to fund through piecework for a dressmaker, deserved better than complete social obscurity. "Efficiently done," a woman's voice observed from behind her. Cass turned to find an elegant older lady watching her with keen interest. She recognized the woman immediately. Everyone did. Beatrice Blackwood, Dowager Duchess of Thornmere, one of the most formidable women in English society, known for her sharp tongue, sharper wit, and absolute refusal to suffer fools. "Your Grace," Cass curtsied, acutely aware of her shabby appearance beside the Duchess's magnificent lavender silk gown. "I was simply trying to prevent further mishap. Most young ladies would have stood back and let the servants handle it." Beatrice, studying Cass with unsettling intensity, or worse, made a dramatic production of the disaster to draw attention to themselves. That seemed unnecessarily cruel to the footman, who was already mortified. Practical and kind. The Duchess's eyes narrowed with interest. "Tell me, what's your name?" "Lady Cassandra Hartwell, Your Grace. My late father was Viscount Hart." "Ah, yes. I remember your father. Good man. I heard he'd fallen on difficult times before his death. There was no pity in the statement, just frank assessment. Medical expenses, wasn't it?" Cass felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "My mother has been ill for several years. My father spent everything trying to find treatments that might help her. Noble, but impractical." Beatrice continued her assessment with the thoroughness of someone evaluating a horse at auction. "Your gloves. Beautifully made. But you've turned them at least twice. I can see the marks where the original stitching was. Your gown is at least 3 years old, though you've disguised it cleverly with new ribbon. And unless I'm very much mistaken, those are paste pearls at your throat, not the genuine Hartwell pearls your grandmother was famous for wearing. Your family has sold the real ones, haven't they?" The frank assessment, delivered without malice but with absolute certainty, left Cass momentarily speechless. She had spent years perfecting her facade of genteel normalcy, and this woman had seen through it in seconds. "I mean, no offence," Beatrice said more gently, though her eyes remained sharp. "I merely need to ensure you'll understand the value of what I'm about to propose." "Propose?" Cass's wariness increased. How old are you, Lady Cassandra? 26, Your Grace. Unmarried, I presume. Yes, Your Grace. Because suitors evaporated when the money did, or because you refused offers from men who saw you as merely decorative? The blunt question startled a laugh from Cass despite her discomfort. Both, actually, though the first preceded the second by a considerable margin. Beatrice's lips twitched with what might have been approval. Honest. I appreciate that. Most young ladies would simper and pretend their unmarried state was entirely by choice. I've found that pretense requires energy I can't afford to spare, Cass said. Reality is exhausting enough without embellishing it. Indeed. The Duchess was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to some decision. Lady Cassandra, I have a proposition for you that will sound utterly mad. But before I make it, tell me, how desperate is your situation? Honestly, Cass's first instinct was to deflect, to maintain the fiction that everything was perfectly fine. But something in the Duchess's expression suggested that dishonesty would be both pointless and offensive. Very desperate, she admitted quietly. My mother requires daily laudanum for the pain and weekly visits from a physician. The costs are substantial. My brother is brilliant, but I can't afford to send him to university. We're living in rented rooms in Cheapside, 3 rooms for the 3 of us, and even that rent is sometimes difficult to manage. I earn what I can doing piecework for a dressmaker, but it barely covers our basic expenses. I'm here today because Lady Pemberton's companion took pity on me and slipped me an invitation, knowing I need to maintain some social connections if there's any hope of my brother securing a decent position. And what would you be willing to do to change those circumstances? Cass looked at the Duchess warily. That depends entirely on what you're proposing, Your Grace. Beatrice laughed, a genuine sound of delight. Excellent answer. Very well, here it is. I need you to pretend to be my son's fiancée for the remainder of this garden party. Cass blinked. I beg your pardon? My son, Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Thornmere. He's currently being hunted by every ambitious mama in London, and I'm tired of fighting them off. If he were engaged, they'd leave him in peace. She gestured across the garden to where a tall, dark-haired man stood surrounded by simpering young ladies and their eager mothers. That's him there, looking thoroughly miserable. Cass followed her gaze. The Duke of Thornmere was indeed striking, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair and aristocratic features that would have been beautiful if not for the expression of barely suppressed irritation he wore like armour. He was perhaps 32, with the kind of classical good looks that belonged in portrait galleries, though his grey eyes held a coldness that suggested he tolerated social gatherings rather than enjoyed them. As Cass watched, he extracted himself from the cluster of women with practised politeness and retreated toward the far end of the garden, his shoulders tight with visible tension. Why me? Cass asked. There are dozens of suitable young ladies here who would be thrilled to play that role. Because you're practical, not silly, Beatrice said bluntly. Because you just told me you're desperate enough to consider unusual arrangements. Because you organize those glasses efficiently without drawing attention to yourself, which suggests you can handle responsibility without theatrics. And because, she gestured to Cass's worn dress and turned gloves, you clearly need money, which means you'll take this seriously as a business arrangement rather than spinning romantic fantasies about actually marrying my son. It should have been insulting. Instead, it was refreshingly honest. What exactly would this arrangement entail? Cass asked carefully. For today, simply stand beside me while I announce to several particularly odious ladies that you're Adrian's intended bride. Look appropriately delighted. Answer questions about your courtship with whatever fiction we devise. Smile. Perhaps gaze at him adoringly once or twice if the moment calls for it. Then tomorrow morning, you and I will discuss compensation for your trouble. Compensation? Quite generous compensation, Beatrice assured her. Enough to make a significant difference to your family's circumstances. Enough to ease your mother's suffering and give your brother real opportunities. Cass thought of her mother, coughing through the nights in their cramped Cheapside rooms, the sound echoing through the thin walls. Of her brother Thomas, brilliant and ambitious, but trapped by poverty, his dreams of university becoming more distant with each passing month, of the physician's latest bill sitting unpaid on her writing desk, the threatening letter from their landlord about overdue rent, the constant weight of responsibility that pressed on her shoulders every waking moment. "One afternoon of pretense," she said slowly, "and then we discuss terms tomorrow." "Precisely. And your son? Does he know about this plan?" Beatrice's smile was decidedly wicked. "He will shortly. That's part of the entertainment." Cass should have said no, should have recognized this as the beginning of something far more complicated than a simple afternoon's deception. But desperation made fools of even sensible people, and she was more desperate than she'd admitted even to herself. "Very well, Your Grace," she said. "I accept." "Excellent." Beatrice linked arms with her proprietarily. "Now, let's create a scandal that will have tongues wagging all the way to Cornwall." What followed was a masterclass in social manipulation. Beatrice steered Cass through the garden party with the precision of a general deploying troops, stopping at strategic clusters of the most influential gossips in London society. "Lady Pemberton," Beatrice called to their hostess, "I have the most delightful news. May I present my son's fiancée, Lady Cassandra Hartwell? They've been conducting a very private courtship, but we've decided it's time to make the announcement official." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Lady Pemberton's teacup rattled in its saucer. The cluster of matrons around her erupted in exclamations of surprise and barely concealed envy. Within moments, they were surrounded by curious guests, all clamouring for details. "When did this happen?" demanded Mrs. Rothbury, whose daughter had been angling for the Duke for 3 seasons running. "How did you meet?" asked Lady Morrison with barely disguised suspicion. "Why haven't we seen you together before?" Lady Pemberton's eyes were sharp with calculation, already assessing the social implications. Cass opened her mouth, scrambling for a plausible story, but Beatrice smoothly intervened. "They met at the British Library," the Duchess said without hesitation. Both were researching the same medieval manuscript. Very romantic, really, bonding over shared intellectual interests rather than shallow social performances. Adrian has always valued intelligence over mere beauty. It was absurd, completely implausible, and yet the gathered ladies seemed to accept it with varying degrees of enthusiasm and disappointment. "How unusual," Mrs. Rothbury sniffed, her tone suggesting she found it more suspicious than romantic. "I wasn't aware the Duke had scholarly interests beyond his parliamentary work." "There's a great deal you don't know about my son," Beatrice replied with a smile that could have frozen water, "which is precisely how he prefers it. Adrian values his privacy tremendously." "And when is the wedding to be?" Lady Pemberton asked, clearly already calculating the social advantage of being among the first to know. "We haven't set a date yet," Beatrice said smoothly. "The engagement is quite new after all. We're allowing the young people time to enjoy their happiness before subjecting them to the circus of wedding planning." The interrogation continued for another 20 minutes. Cass found herself spinning details about a courtship that had never happened, their first conversation about medieval poetry, which she'd supposedly found tedious until Adrian's passionate defence of the art form had changed her mind, their mutual love of morning rides in Hyde Park, where they could converse without social interruption, the quiet moment when he'd proposed in the library stacks with no witnesses but thousands of books, dropping to one knee between the philosophy and history sections. She was improvising desperately, trying to remember details that would sound believable while maintaining consistency in her lies, when she caught sight of the Duke himself approaching. He was striding across the lawn with purpose, his expression thunderous, and Cass felt her stomach drop with apprehension. "Mother," he said in a voice of deadly calm, "might I have a word?" "Adrian, darling." Beatrice turned to him with theatrical delight. "Perfect timing. I was just introducing everyone to Cassandra, your fiancée." The Duke's grey eyes, sharp and furious, fixed on Cass with an intensity that made her want to step backward. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd thought, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, with shoulders that suggested he spent time doing more than sitting in the House of Lords. His features were classical, high cheekbones, straight nose, strong jaw, But it was his eyes that arrested her, grey like storm clouds, intelligent and assessing, currently blazing with barely controlled fury. "My what?" he asked, each word precisely enunciated. "Your fiancée," Beatrice repeated cheerfully. "Lady Cassandra Hartwell. Surely you haven't forgotten the woman you've been courting for months." For a heartbeat, Cass thought he would denounce the entire charade right there in front of 50 witnesses. His jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides, and she could practically feel the rage radiating from him like heat from a forge. But then his gaze shifted to take in their audience. Dozens of eager faces watching this drama unfold, matrons leaning forward with avid interest, young ladies whispering behind fans, and something in his expression changed. Calculation replaced fury, and when he looked back at Cass, his eyes held a warning that made her pulse spike with apprehension. "Of course," he said smoothly, his voice conveying warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "How could I forget? Lady Cassandra and I have been very close these past months." He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that looked romantic, but felt like a brand. His grip was just slightly too tight, his smile just slightly too sharp, and Cass understood with sudden clarity that she was going to pay for participating in his mother's scheme. "Might I steal my beloved away for a private word?" he asked the assembled ladies with impeccable courtesy. "We have so much to discuss after being apart for these few days." It wasn't a request. Before Cass could protest, he was steering her away from the crowd with a hand at her elbow that felt more like a manacle than a courtesy. His fingers pressed into her arm just firmly enough to convey his displeasure without actually hurting her, and his pace was brisk enough that she had to hurry to keep up. They'd barely cleared the crowd when he pulled her behind a tall hedge that provided privacy from curious eyes. The moment they were hidden, he released her arm and stepped back, putting distance between them as if proximity to her was physically painful. "What the hell?" he said, in a low, furious voice that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "Do you think you're playing at?" Cass lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed, despite her racing heart. "I'm not playing at anything, Your Grace. Your mother approached me with this scheme not 20 minutes ago. I was simply reorganizing refreshments and trying not to be noticed when she decided I would make a convenient prop for her theatrical production. And you simply agreed, without question, without considering the implications of announcing to half of London society that you're engaged to a duke. She offered compensation," Cass said bluntly, tired of pretense. "I need money desperately. She was offering to pay me to pretend for an afternoon. It seemed straightforward enough at the time." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her honesty. Most women in similar circumstances would have manufactured some romantic justification or claimed to have been coerced. Most women would at least pretend to have some romantic motive. "I'm not most women, Your Grace, and I'm far too tired to waste energy on pretty lies." She met his furious gaze directly, refusing to look away. "Your mother manipulated us both. If you want to direct your anger somewhere, perhaps aim it at the person who actually orchestrated this farce rather than taking it out on me." His jaw worked, and for a moment Cass thought he might actually explode. But then something shifted in his expression. Not acceptance, certainly, but perhaps grudging recognition that she had a point. "Fine," he bit out. "You want honesty? Here it is. You've just announced to half of London society that you're engaged to me. Do you have any idea what that means? The scrutiny you've invited, the expectations you've created, the gossip that will follow you everywhere you go from this moment forward." "I imagine I'll find out shortly," Cass said with more calm than she felt. "Though I notice you didn't denounce the engagement when you had the chance. You could have exposed your mother's manipulation right there in front of everyone. Why didn't you?" His expression turned even colder, if that were possible. "Because publicly humiliating my mother, and you, would create a scandal that serves no one. The Thornmere name would be damaged. You would be ruined socially, and my mother would become a laughingstock. Better to maintain the fiction temporarily and end it quietly later when fewer people are paying attention." "Agreed," Cass said. Which brings us back to your mother's promise of compensation. I assume she'll honor that. You're remarkably mercenary about this. I'm remarkably desperate, Cass corrected. There's a difference. My mother is dying slowly because I can't afford the treatments that might help her. My brilliant brother will never attend university because I can barely afford food and rent. I do piecework for a dressmaker 16 hours a day and still fall short of our expenses every month. So yes, when someone offers me money to pretend for an afternoon, I take it. If you'd prefer I collapse into maidenly vapours and pretend this is all a wonderful romantic adventure, I can certainly oblige. But I thought you might appreciate straightforward negotiation over theatrical nonsense. His expression shifted again, this time towards something that might have been reluctant respect. You have a spine at least. That's more than I can say for most of the simpering misses my mother usually throws at me. I'm sure they're lovely young ladies who simply haven't learned yet that honesty is more efficient than performance. Again, that flash of something, amusement maybe, beneath his anger. We'll discuss this tomorrow, he said finally. My mother has undoubtedly scheduled some meeting to formalize whatever insane arrangement she's concocted. Until then, we maintain the fiction in public. Understood? Perfectly. Good. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her with those storm-grey eyes. And, Lady Cassandra, don't get any ideas about making this permanent. This ends when I say it ends, not a moment later. I don't care how desperate you are or how much money my mother offers you. You will never actually be my Duchess. The words were designed to wound, to put her firmly in her place, and they succeeded. Cass felt the sting of them, even as she kept her expression neutral. I wouldn't dream of aspiring so high, Your Grace, she said coolly. After all, what could a desperate pieceworker possibly offer a duke beyond temporary convenience? She swept away before he could respond, heading back toward the garden party with her head high and her heart pounding. Behind her, she heard him swear softly, but she didn't look back. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of congratulations and barely concealed envy. Cass played her role as best she could, accepting good wishes from women who'd never spoken to her before, answering questions about the fictional courtship with increasingly elaborate lies, and trying not to think about the cold fury in Adrian's eyes. When the garden party finally concluded and Cass made her way home to Cheapside on foot, she couldn't afford the hackney fare. Her feet ached, her head throbbed, and she felt the weight of what she'd agreed to settle over her like a physical burden. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs to their rented rooms and found her mother dozing in the threadbare chair by the window, her breathing laboured even in sleep. Thomas looked up from the book he was reading, borrowed from a friend because they couldn't afford to buy books, and his expression brightened. How was the party? He asked. Cass looked at her brother, at her mother, at the cramped rooms that smelled of illness and poverty, and she made a decision. Actually, Thomas, she said slowly, something rather extraordinary happened. I appear to have gotten engaged. Her mother's eyes flew open. You what? To the Duke of Thornmere. His mother announced it to the entire garden party. The wedding is supposed to be in 3 months. There was a long, profound silence. Then her mother struggled to sit up straighter, coughing with the effort. Cassandra Charlotte Hartwell, she said, when she could speak again. Sit down and explain yourself this instant. As Cass recounted the afternoon's events, she watched her mother's expression cycle through disbelief, horror, and finally cautious calculation. Let me understand this correctly, her mother said when Cass had finished. The Dowager Duchess of Thornmere has promised to compensate you, us, for participating in a false engagement to her son. Yes, an engagement that will supposedly last 3 months and then be quietly dissolved. And you believe she'll actually pay what she's promised? The Dowager Duchess didn't become one of the most influential women in London by breaking her word, Mother. If anything, her reputation for keeping promises is fearsome. She honours her commitments absolutely, which is why people fear crossing her. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, her thin fingers plucking at the worn fabric of her dress. Do you know what this could mean for us if she keeps her word? I know, Mother. Your father's debts could be paid. I could see a proper physician instead of that quack who takes our money and provides laudanum but little else. Thomas could attend university as he deserves. I know. Thomas, who'd been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. But Cass, this is mad. What happens when the Duke discovers what you've agreed to? From what you've described, he's already furious. He is, Cass admitted. Absolutely furious. But he agreed to maintain the fiction temporarily to avoid scandal. We're meeting tomorrow to discuss terms. This is dangerous, her mother said quietly. If it goes wrong, if the Duke decides to publicly denounce the arrangement, your reputation will be destroyed. No decent man would ever consider you after being associated with such a scandal. Mother, no decent man has considered me for 3 years anyway. Our poverty has seen to that. At least this way, if it works, we might actually have a future that doesn't involve slow starvation and watching you suffer because we can't afford proper care. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. I never wanted this for you. Any of this. You shouldn't have to sell yourself. I'm not selling myself, Cass interrupted firmly. I'm accepting payment for a service, pretending to be engaged for 3 months. That's all. The Duke made it abundantly clear that this will never be real, and honestly, that's a relief. I have no illusions about my place in the world, Mother, but I do have a chance to improve our circumstances, and I'm not going to let pride or fear stop me from taking it. Thomas crossed to her chair and knelt beside it, taking her hand. You're the bravest person I know, he said quietly. I'm not brave, Cass replied. I'm just tired of losing. That night, as she lay on the narrow bed in the tiny room she shared with her mother, listening to the familiar sounds of her mother's laboured breathing, Cass stared at the cracked ceiling and wondered what she'd actually agreed to. Somewhere across London, in a house she'd never seen, a duke was probably contemplating murder, specifically the murder of his meddling mother, and possibly the impoverished lady who'd agreed to her scheme. Tomorrow she would face him again, and they would negotiate the terms of this impossible arrangement. She had no idea what to expect beyond his continued fury and her own desperate need for the money Beatrice had promised. Sleep, when it finally came, was restless and filled with dreams of grey eyes and cold dismissals. The following morning, Cass arrived at Thornmere House in Mayfair at precisely 10 o'clock, as specified in the note the Dowager Duchess had sent to her Cheapside lodgings. The note had been delivered by a proper footman in Thornmere livery, which had caused quite a stir among her. Mrs. Henderson from the floor below had actually knocked on their door to ask if everything was quite all right, her eyes gleaming with curiosity about the ducal servant standing in their shabby hallway. The townhouse was magnificent, all gleaming white stone and imposing columns that announced wealth and power with quiet certainty. The entrance alone was larger than the entire set of rooms her family occupied. Cass felt her shabby dress and worn gloves with acute embarrassment as she climbed the pristine steps to the gleaming black door. A butler admitted her with the kind of professional neutrality that suggested he'd witnessed stranger things than impoverished ladies claiming to be the Duke's fiancée. He was elderly, perhaps 60, with the kind of dignified bearing that came from decades of service in aristocratic households. Lady Cassandra Hartwell, she said, trying to sound confident despite her intimidation. Her Grace is expecting you, my lady. Please, follow me. He led her through marble halls that made her shabby dress seem even more threadbare by comparison. Portraits of stern Thornmere ancestors lined the wall. Generations of aristocratic faces looking down with what seemed like disapproval. The house smelled of beeswax and fresh flowers, expensive perfume and old money. Everything gleamed with the kind of care that required an army of servants. Finally, the butler deposited her in an elegant drawing room where Beatrice waited with tea already prepared. The Dowager Duchess looked no less formidable than she had at the garden party, dressed in a morning gown of dove-grey silk that probably cost more than Cass's entire wardrobe. Punctual, Beatrice observed with approval as Cass entered. Excellent quality in a conspirator. I prefer to think of myself as an unwitting participant, Cass replied, settling into the indicated chair. Semantics, dear. Now, shall we discuss terms before my son arrives? He'll be here shortly. I summoned him from his study precisely 15 minutes ago, which means he's currently pacing in his private sitting room, trying to compose himself enough to face us without committing matricide. How reassuring, Beatrice laughed. You have a spine. I appreciate that. Far too many young ladies would be simpering and apologizing by now. Before Cass could respond, the door opened with rather more force than necessary, and Adrian strode in, looking no less furious than he had yesterday. He'd clearly come straight from his study. His dark blue jacket was missing, his waistcoat unbuttoned at the top, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that suggested he did more than push papers around, and his cravat was loosened in a way that suggested he'd been pulling at it in frustration. "Mother," he said without preamble, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Explain yourself." "Good morning, darling. Would you like tea? I had Cook prepare those almond biscuits you're so fond of. I want an explanation for why half of London believes I'm engaged to a woman I'd never met before yesterday." "You've met her now," Beatrice said mildly, pouring tea with perfect composure. "And I must say, she's handling this with considerably more grace than you are. Do sit down, Adrian. Looming is terribly unbecoming, even for a duke." Adrian's gaze swung to Cass, and she felt the full force of his displeasure like a physical thing. "Lady Cassandra and I need to establish some parameters for this situation." "Excellent idea," Beatrice said cheerfully. "Why don't we all sit down and discuss this like civilized people? I don't feel particularly civilized at the moment." Nevertheless, Beatrice gestured to a chair. "Sit, darling. You're giving me a crick in my neck from looking up at you." To Cass's surprise, he obeyed, though his expression suggested he was doing so under extreme duress. He positioned himself as far from both women as the seating arrangement allowed, in a chair near the fireplace, radiating hostility like a furnace radiating heat. "Lady Cassandra," he said with cutting formality, addressing her directly for the first time. "My mother tells me you're in need of money." "Your mother is remarkably well informed about my circumstance," Cass replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "She makes it her business to know everyone's vulnerabilities. It's one of her more charming qualities." The sarcasm was acid sharp. "What precisely is your situation? And I want details, not vague allusions to difficult times." Cass glanced at Beatrice, who nodded encouragingly. She drew a breath and decided that if they wanted details, she would provide them. "My mother is seriously ill with a lung condition that grows progressively worse. She requires daily laudanum for the pain and weekly visits from a physician, though frankly, the physician we can afford is barely competent. The costs are approximately £40 monthly, which might not sound like much to someone at your station, but it's devastating to us. My brother Thomas is 17 and brilliant. He should be preparing for university, but instead, he's working as a clerk for a shipping company, earning barely enough to contribute to our rent. We live in 3 rooms in Cheapside. The neighbourhood is not dangerous, but it's not respectable either. I do piecework for a dressmaker 16 hours a day. Hemming, basic alterations, anything that doesn't require significant skill. And I earn perhaps £30 monthly if I'm fortunate. Between the 3 of us, we barely manage £70 monthly, and our expenses are 80. We've been selling off everything we own piece by piece. My grandmother's jewellery, my father's books, our furniture. We have almost nothing left." She met his eyes directly, refusing to show shame for circumstances beyond her control. "So yes, Your Grace, I need money desperately. When your mother offered to compensate me for pretending to be engaged to you for an afternoon, I accepted because I'm trying to keep my family alive. If that makes me mercenary in your eyes, so be it." The room was silent for a long moment. Adrian's expression had shifted from anger to something more complicated, not quite sympathy, but perhaps understanding. "Why should I agree to this farce?" he asked finally. "Because the damage is already done," Beatrice interjected smoothly. "By now, everyone who attended Lady Pemberton's party has spread the news to everyone they know. The announcement was witnessed by at least 50 people, including some of London's most influential gossip. If you denounce it now, you create a scandal that damages all of us. Cassandra's reputation will be destroyed, my credibility will be questioned, and your own standing will suffer. Or I could simply announce that you manipulated us both without our knowledge or consent. You could, Beatrice agreed calmly, but that makes you look weak, unable to control your own mother, easily duped by her schemes, requiring public rescue from your own supposed engagement. Is that really the image you wish to project? The Duke who was tricked by his meddling mother and had to publicly extricate himself from an engagement he never wanted? Adrian's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Cass recognized the trapped look in his eyes. He was caught between bad options and searching for the least damaging path forward. 3 months, he said finally, his voice flat. We maintain the fiction for 3 months. That gives society time to accept it, grow bored with it, and move on to other gossip. Then we stage a quiet, mutual dissolution of the engagement. We discover we don't suit after all. Perfectly amicable separation. No scandal, no drama, no blame assigned to either party. Agreed, Beatrice said promptly. And the compensation? Cass asked quietly. Adrian's attention snapped back to her, his grey eyes assessing. What would be adequate? And before you answer, understand that I expect honesty. Don't undervalue yourself out of pride or false modesty, but don't try to extort me either. She'd spent half the night calculating, trying to determine what amount would actually make a difference without seeming greedy. My mother's medical expenses are approximately £40 monthly. If those could be paid directly to her physician for the duration of the arrangement, that would ensure her care continues regardless of what happens. It would also free up money for food and rent, which would be tremendous relief. And at the end of 3 months, a lump sum of £300 would give me enough to secure better lodgings in a safer neighbourhood and provide funds for my brother to attend university for at least his first year. Mercenary, but specific, Adrian observed. I appreciate clarity. Is that all? All. Cass stared at him. Your Grace, that's more money than my family has seen in 3 years. I'm aware. But I'm asking if there's anything else you need. Clothing suitable for the role you'll be playing, for instance. You can't attend balls and dinners in... He gestured to her dress, not unkindly but frankly. That. Heat flooded Cass's cheeks. I have other gowns. I'm sure you do. And I'm sure they're all 5 years old and have been turned over multiple times. His tone was matter-of-fact rather than cruel. This isn't an insult, Lady Cassandra. It's a practical necessity. If you're going to convincingly play the role of my fiancée, you'll need to look the part. That means a proper wardrobe. I can't possibly accept. It's not a gift, he interrupted. It's a business expense. You're providing a service, and proper costuming is required for the performance. We'll make arrangements for you to visit a modiste. Mother can accompany you and ensure everything is appropriate. How generous, Cass said, not bothering to hide her irritation at being discussed like a doll requiring new clothes. How practical, he corrected. Now, about the living arrangements. Living arrangements. Cass felt an alarm spike through her. Obviously, you'll need to move into this house. Absolutely not, Cass said. At the same time, Beatrice said, What? Adrian stood abruptly, moving to the window as if he couldn't bear to sit still any longer. Think about it practically. If we're going to convince London society that this engagement is real, we need to be seen together regularly. Dinners, balls, morning rides in the park, afternoon teas, all the tedious courtship rituals people expect. That's far easier to coordinate if you're living under the same roof. With my mother as chaperone, of course. Everything will be perfectly proper. That's highly irregular, Cass protested. So is arranging a fake engagement, Adrian countered, turning from the window to face them. His expression was calculating now rather than merely angry. Besides, plenty of engaged couples live in the same household with proper supervision. It's not unheard of, particularly when the bride has no close family in London to stay with. He was testing her, Cass realised, expecting her to refuse, to prove she wasn't actually desperate enough to go through with it. All right, she said, meeting his challenging gaze directly. I'll move in, but we establish clear boundaries, separate wings of the house, no expectations beyond public appearances. This arrangement is purely business, nothing more. Something flickered in Adrian's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd called his bluff. Purely business. You'll have your own suite in the West Wing, well away from my apartments in the East Wing. My mother's rooms are between us, which should satisfy any concerns about propriety. You can move in tomorrow. Tomorrow? Cass's head was spinning. Everything was moving too fast. No point in delaying, Beatrice said briskly. The sooner you're established here, the sooner we can begin appearing in public together and reinforcing the fiction. I'll have the Rose Suite prepared for you. It has a lovely sitting room and adequate space for your belongings, though I suspect you don't have many belongings to move. The casual observation stung, but it was accurate. Very little, Cass admitted. Excellent. Less to pack then. Beatrice stood, indicating the meeting was concluding. I'll send a carriage for you and your things tomorrow morning at 10. And Cassandra, do bring your mother and brother. We have plenty of room, and it seems cruel to separate you from them when their care is part of what motivated you to accept this arrangement. Cass felt tears prick behind her eyes at the unexpected kindness. Thank you, Your Grace. That's very generous. Not generous. Practical. You'll perform your role better if you're not worried constantly about your family's welfare. Beatrice moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Adrian, do try to be civil when you see Cassandra tomorrow. Scowling at her constantly will rather undermine the fiction that you're madly in love. After Beatrice swept out, presumably to begin making arrangements, Cass found herself alone with Adrian. The silence stretched uncomfortably. You should know, he said without looking at her, his voice tight, that I despise deception. Then you must find this situation particularly galling. I do. He turned to face her, and the cold fury in his eyes made her breath catch. I'm agreeing to this farce because the alternative is worse. A public scandal that damages my family's name and destroys whatever chance you have of securing decent marriage prospects in the future. But let me be very clear. We will play our roles in public, but in private, we maintain absolute honesty. No games, no manipulation, no attempts to extend this arrangement beyond the agreed-upon 3 months. Are we understood? Perfectly, Cass replied, lifting her chin. And let me be equally clear. I'm here because I need to save my family, not because I'm angling to become a duchess. The moment this arrangement becomes untenable, I'll walk away regardless of the consequences. I have too much pride to force myself on someone who's made his contempt abundantly evident. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or reluctant respect. Fair enough. Is there anything else, Your Grace? Adrian, he said abruptly. If we're supposed to be engaged, you should use my given name, at least in private. Very well. Adrian. The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her uncomfortable. And you should call me Cassandra, or Cass if you... Cassandra, he repeated, and something about the way he said it made her pulse skip. We'll make the best of this absurd situation, but don't expect friendship or warmth beyond what's necessary for the performance. I wouldn't dream of it, Cass assured. With that cold dismissal, he left her standing in the elegant drawing room, wondering what she'd actually committed herself to. She found her own way out. The butler appeared silently to escort her, which suggested the household staff was remarkably well trained in anticipating needs. As she walked back through the marble halls toward the entrance, she caught glimpses of the house that would soon be her temporary home. A music room with a piano that gleamed with polish. A library that made her heart ache with longing. Thousands of books lining the walls from floor to ceiling. A portrait gallery with generations of Thornmeres looking down with aristocratic disdain. It was beautiful, it was intimidating, and it was going to be her prison for the next 3 months. When she arrived back in Cheapside and told her mother and Thomas about the arrangement, the money, the move to Thornmere House, the 3 months of pretense ahead, her mother looked both relieved and worried. This is dangerous, Cass, she said quietly, living under his roof, pretending to love him. What if... She broke off, coughing. What if what, Mother? What if the pretense starts feeling real? What if you develop actual feelings for him? Cass thought of Adrian's cold eyes, his cutting dismissals, his obvious contempt for the situation and for her. I don't think that's a risk, she said honestly. He's made it abundantly clear that he despises this arrangement and tolerates me only out of necessity. There's no danger of me mistaking obligation for affection. But even as she said it, she remembered the way his eyes had assessed her with something other than anger when she'd laid out her desperate circumstance, the way he'd offered to provide clothing without being asked, the way he'd said her name. No, she was being foolish. This was business, nothing more. The following morning, a Thornmere carriage arrived at their Cheapside lodgings precisely at 10 o'clock, causing even more of a stir among their neighbours than the footman had the day before. Mrs. Henderson actually came outside to watch as their few belongings were loaded. 2 small trunks for Cass, 1 for her mother, Thomas's single bag. "Moving up in the world, are we?" Mrs. Henderson asked with thinly veiled envy. "Temporary situation," Cass replied politely, helping her mother into the carriage. The ride from Cheapside to Mayfair was like travelling between 2 different countries. The streets grew cleaner, the buildings more elegant, the people better dressed. Her mother stared out the window with wide eyes, and Thomas kept his nose pressed to the glass, taking in everything. When they arrived at Thornmere House, a small army of servants stood ready to help. The butler, she learned his name was Thompson, directed everything with quiet efficiency. Her mother was shown to rooms adjoining Cass's suite, spacious and bright with windows overlooking the garden. Thomas was given a room on the 3rd floor near the library, which made his eyes light up with excitement, and Cass was shown to the Rose Suite. It was beautiful, more luxurious than anywhere she'd lived even before her family's fall from grace. The sitting room was decorated in shades of cream and rose with elegant furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable. Through another door was a bedroom with a 4-poster bed draped in silk hangings. A dressing room with more closet space than she'd ever needed. Everything gleamed with fresh polish and smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax. "His Grace's private apartments are in the East Wing," Thompson informed her with perfect neutrality. "The Dowager Duchess's rooms are directly below yours. Breakfast is served in the morning room at 8 o'clock precisely. Luncheon is informal. Trays can be brought to your rooms if you prefer. Dinner is at 7 in the formal dining room. His Grace requests that you dress appropriately for dinner." "Of course," Cass managed, feeling overwhelmed. "If you require anything for your comfort, please ring." Thompson indicated the bell pull. "A maid will be assigned to attend you shortly. Her name is Mary, and she's been with the household for 5 years. Very capable girl." After Thompson withdrew, Cass sank into one of the elegant chairs and tried to process everything. Just 2 days ago, she'd been hemming skirts in their cramped Cheapside rooms. Now she was living in a duke's house, surrounded by luxury she'd forgotten existed, pretending to be engaged to a man who despised her. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. A young woman entered, Mary, presumably, neat and competent looking in her maid's uniform. "Begging your pardon, my lady," Mary said with a curtsy. "Her Grace sent word that you're to visit the modiste this afternoon. The carriage will be ready at 2 o'clock. She asked me to help you prepare." And so it began. The transformation of Cassandra Hartwell from impoverished lady to duchess in training. Mary helped her into the least shabby of her day dresses, did something clever with her hair that made it look less plain. And at precisely 2 o'clock, Cass found herself in the carriage with Beatrice, heading to Bond Street. The modiste, Madame Laurent, a French woman with sharp eyes and sharper pins, assessed Cass with the thoroughness of an art appraiser evaluating a painting. "She has good bones," Madame Laurent said to Beatrice, as if Cass weren't standing right there. "The colouring is acceptable. With proper clothing, she will do it." "She'll need to do considerably better than do," Beatrice said crisply. "She's to be the Duchess of Thornmere. She needs to look the part. Evening gowns for balls and dinners. Morning dresses for calls and teas. Riding habit. Walking dresses. Everything a lady of her new station would require." What followed was 3 hours of measurements, fabric selections, and increasingly elaborate designs. Cass tried to protest the expense. Silks and satins in jewel tones, lace and embroidery, gowns that would cost more than her family had lived on for months. But Beatrice was immovable. "You're playing a role," Beatrice said firmly, when Cass objected to a particularly expensive ball gown in sapphire silk. "That requires proper costuming. Besides, these aren't gifts. They're tools for the job you've agreed to do." By the time they returned to Thornmere House, Cass's head was spinning with fabric choices and fitting schedules. Madame Laurent had promised to have at least 3 gowns ready within 2 days, with the rest to follow over the next fortnight. That first dinner at Thornmere House set the pattern for what was to come. Cass dressed in her least shabby evening gown, knowing it would be among the last times she'd have to wear it, and made her way to the dining room precisely at 7. Adrian was already there, standing by the window with a glass of whiskey, dressed in impeccable black that made him look like something from a Renaissance painting, devastatingly handsome and completely unapproachable. He turned when she entered, his eyes sweeping over her worn dress with an expression that might have been pitiful if it weren't so carefully neutral. "Lady Cassandra," he said formally. "Punctual. I appreciate that in a person. I try not to waste other people's time," she replied, taking the seat a footman held for. "Even when you're being forced into their company through maternal scheming." His lips twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "At least we agree on something." The first course was served, a delicate soup that Cass barely tasted. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet clink of silver on china. Finally, Adrian spoke. "We should probably establish some ground rules beyond what we discussed yesterday. Beyond moving into your house and pretending to be madly in love. Beyond those, yes." He set down his spoon with precise care. "First, I expect discretion. Whatever happens or doesn't happen within these walls stays private. No gossiping with friends, no confiding in family beyond what's absolutely necessary to maintain the fiction." "Agreed." "Second, we'll need to coordinate our schedules. I have obligations that can't be avoided. Parliamentary sessions, estate business, social events I've already committed to attending. You'll need to accompany me to at least some of them to maintain appearances." I expected that. "Third," he paused, studying her with those penetrating grey eyes, "we should probably make an effort to actually know each other. People who are supposedly in love generally have conversations beyond logistics and contracts. If we're questioned about our courtship or our compatibility, we should be able to answer with at least some semblance of truth." "What a revolutionary concept," Cass said dryly. "Engaged couples actually talking to each other." "Don't be sarcastic. Then don't state the obvious, Your Grace." They glared at each other across the table. Then unexpectedly, Adrian laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed his stern features entirely, making him look younger and far less intimidating. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. "What did you expect? Someone more compliant, simpering perhaps? Most women confronted by a duke's displeasure would be apologizing profusely by now, trying to placate me." "I'm not most women," Cass reminded him, "and I didn't actually do anything wrong. Your mother orchestrated this situation. If you want apologies, direct them appropriately." "Fair point." He leaned back in his chair, regarding her with new interest. "Tell me about yourself, Lady Cassandra. Beyond the financial difficulties that brought you into this mess. Who are you when you're not struggling to survive?" It was the first time he'd asked her anything personal, and the unexpected curiosity in his tone caught her off guard. Cass considered how much to reveal. "I'm 26 years old," she began carefully. "I had one season when I was 18 that was moderately successful until my father's investments collapsed. I enjoyed it at the time, the dancing, the attention, but looking back, it all seems rather shallow. I enjoy reading, mostly philosophy and history. I'm reasonably competent at watercolours, though I have no particular talent. I speak French adequately and Italian poorly. I'm better at mathematics than is considered appropriate for a lady, which has made me rather unpopular in certain circles where intelligence in women is viewed with suspicion. And I strongly dislike gossip, which has made me even more unpopular, since gossip is apparently the primary currency of polite society." "Philosophy?" Adrian's interest sharpened visibly. "My mother mentioned something about that in her fictional story about how we met." "What do you read?" Currently nothing, since I can't afford to buy books and the lending library requires a subscription fee I don't have. But before my family's circumstances changed, I enjoyed Locke's essays on understanding. I found his thoughts on epistemology fascinating. The question of what we can truly know versus what we merely believe we know. Most ladies I've met consider philosophy tedious. Most gentlemen I've met consider ladies tedious. Cass countered. So perhaps we're even. He laughed again, clearly surprised and perhaps pleased by her response. Touché. And mathematics? My father taught me when I was young, before he realized it wasn't considered proper for girls to understand numbers beyond basic household accounting. I've kept studying on my own when I can. There's something deeply satisfying about problems that have definite solutions, unlike most of life, which is just endless ambiguity and compromise. I can't argue with that sentiment. Adrian reached for his wine glass, his expression thoughtful. All right, my turn. I'm 32. I attended Cambridge, where I studied classics and philosophy, much to my father's dismay. He thought I should focus on estate management and politics. I take my seat in the House of Lords seriously, perhaps too seriously according to some of my peers. Currently, I'm involved in reform discussions about poor laws and factory working conditions, trying to convince wealthy men that treating workers like human beings is morally correct, even if it's financially inconvenient. That's quite progressive thinking for a duke. I prefer principled to progressive, he said, though there was no heat in the correction. I collect first edition philosophy texts, which probably makes me tedious to most people. I fence regularly because I enjoy the discipline and the physical release. And I despise dancing, despite being adequately skilled at it, because it requires making small talk with simpering debutantes, while their mothers evaluate me like prize livestock at auction. Why do you hate dancing specifically? Cass asked, genuinely curious. Because it's performative nonsense, Adrian said bluntly. Young ladies taught to simper and flatter. Mothers positioning their daughters like chess pieces. Everyone pretending to enjoy themselves, while actually calculating social advantages. It's an exhausting theatre. Though I suppose, he added with a grimace, I'll have to dance with you now to maintain appearances. Lucky me. Lucky us, he corrected. We're both stuck in this ridiculous situation. The main course arrived, roasted duck with vegetables, that was the best meal Cass had eaten in months. And they ate in more comfortable silence. She found herself relaxing slightly. Adrian Blackwood might be arrogant and clearly resentful of this engagement, but he was also intelligent and surprisingly honest. There were worse qualities in a temporary fiancé. There's a dinner party at Lady Hathaway's tomorrow evening, Adrian said after a while. Our first proper public appearance as an engaged couple. Are you prepared for that? It will be considerably more scrutiny than the garden party. Smaller group, more intimate setting, more opportunity for people to ask detailed questions about our... As prepared as one can be for public deception, Cass replied. What do I need to know? Stick to the story my mother invented about the British Library. I'll back it up if questioned. Stay close to me during the evening. Engaged couples are expected to be somewhat inseparable, particularly when the engagement is new. Answer questions about our courtship with enough detail to seem genuine, but not so much that we contradict each other. And for heaven's sake, try to look at me occasionally as if I'm not completely insufferable. That might require considerable acting skill on... I have complete faith in your abilities, he said, echoing his mother's earlier words with obvious sarcasm. After all, you convinced half of London you were delighted to be engaged to me despite having met me approximately 10 minutes before the announcement. Desperation makes one a surprisingly good actress. Something shifted in his expression, not quite sympathy, but perhaps acknowledgement of the truth in that statement. For what it's worth, Lady Cassandra, you're handling this situation with considerably more grace than I expected. Most women would be either swooning with delight at the prospect of becoming a duchess or weeping with mortification at being trapped in a false engagement. You're doing neither. Would you prefer swooning or weeping? I can certainly oblige if it would make you feel better. God, no. Your pragmatism is actually rather refreshing. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words. I apologize if I was unduly harsh yesterday and this morning. This situation is not your fault. You're as much a victim of my mother's meddling as I am. I shouldn't have taken my anger out on you." The apology was unexpected enough to leave Cass momentarily speechless. "Thank you, I appreciate that." "Adrian," he reminded her. "We agreed on given names in private. Adrian then, and you should call me Cassandra. Or Cass if you prefer. That's what my family used." "Cassandra suits you better," he said thoughtfully. "Cass is too casual, too diminutive. Cassandra has gravity. I'm not sure whether that's a compliment or an observation about my personality. Both, perhaps." He stood, indicating dinner was concluded. "I typically spend evenings in the library when I'm not required elsewhere. You're welcome to join me, or not as you prefer. I don't expect us to be constantly in each other's company. That would be exhausting for both of us." "Agreed." Cass stood as well. "Though I should warn you, I noticed your library earlier, and I may spend considerable time there. Books have been a luxury I couldn't afford for 3 years." "The library is yours to use as you wish," Adrian said. "Everything is organized by subject and author. I'd appreciate volumes being returned to their proper places, but otherwise, consider it at your disposal." After he left, presumably heading to the library he'd mentioned, Cass made her way back to the Rose Suite. She found her mother settled comfortably in the sitting room, looking more relaxed than Cass had seen her in months. "This is extraordinary," her mother said quietly. "A real physician came this afternoon, sent by the Dowager Duchess. He examined me properly, prescribed new medications, and said the treatments I've been receiving were worse than useless. Cass, he thinks he can actually help me." Tears sprang to Cass's eyes. "That's wonderful, Mum." "And Thomas? He's in the library, absolutely over the moon. Apparently there are first editions of texts he's only read in badly printed versions." Her mother reached for Cass's hand. "You did this. You gave us this chance." "I'm pretending to be engaged for 3 months," Cass reminded her. "That's all. That's everything," her mother corrected. "Don't diminish what you're doing for us." That night, lying in the enormous 4-poster bed in a new room, Cass stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything. 2 days ago, she'd been hemming skirts for pennies in their cramped Cheapside rooms. Now she was living in a duke's house, with a proper physician treating her mother, her brother having access to books he'd dreamed of reading, and a wardrobe of expensive gowns being made. The cost was 3 months of pretending to love a man who'd made clear he despised the situation. 3 months of public performances and private awkwardness. 3 months of walking a careful line between necessary deception and maintaining enough emotional distance to leave at the end without her heart being broken. She could do this. She had to do this. But as she drifted towards sleep, she found herself remembering the way Adrian had laughed at dinner, the unexpected apology he'd offered, the genuine interest in his eyes when they discussed philosophy. "Don't be foolish," she told herself firmly. "This is business, nothing more." But the warning felt hollow, even as she thought it. The first week in Thornmere House passed in a blur of awkward encounters and forced civility. Breakfasts were tense affairs where Cass and Adrian maintained polite conversation, while Beatrice watched them with barely concealed amusement. Dinners followed the same pattern: careful courtesy, occasional discussions of books or politics, an underlying tension that never quite dissipated. Lady Hathaway's dinner party was every bit as challenging as Adrian had warned. The moment they arrived, Cass felt dozens of eyes fix on them with avid curiosity. Lady Hathaway herself, a formidable matron with connections to half the aristocracy, greeted them with effusive congratulations that barely concealed her surprise at the match. "Duke Thornmere, how delightful! And Lady Cassandra, what a charming surprise this engagement has been. Do come in, come in. Everyone is absolutely dying to meet the woman who finally captured our most eligible bachelor." The dining room blazed with candles, reflecting off crystal and silver. Cass found herself seated between Adrian and Lord Pemberton, an older gentleman who seemed determined to interrogate her about the courtship. "Fascinating story about the British Library," Lord Pemberton said, his eyes shrewd. "I wasn't aware Thornmere had scholarly interests beyond his political work." "The Duke is full of surprises," Cass replied. reaching for her wineglass to steady her nerves. Adrian's hand covered hers briefly, a gesture that appeared affectionate, but allowed him to murmur quietly, "Steady, you're doing fine." The brief touch sent unexpected warmth through her, though she told herself it was just relief at his support. Throughout the meal, Adrian played his role flawlessly. He held her chair, ensured her wineglass was filled, engaged her in conversation about the philosophy texts they'd discussed, and generally appeared to be a man genuinely fascinated by his fiancée. To any observer, they seemed like a couple deeply interested in each other. "You're quite good at this," Cass murmured during a lull in conversation. "Years of practice at social deception," Adrian replied quietly. "Every duke learns early how to appear charming while feeling nothing whatsoever." "How exhausting." "Exceedingly." His eyes met hers, and something flickered in them. Sympathy, perhaps. "Though I suspect you understand that better than most. Playing roles for society's benefit while maintaining your actual self somewhere private and protected." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Before Cass could respond, Lady Cromwell descended on them with her daughter Arabella in tow. "Your Grace, Lady Cassandra, how delightful to see you both," Lady Cromwell gushed. "May I present my daughter, Miss Arabella Cromwell? Bella, dear, say hello to the Duke and his fiancée." Arabella curtsied prettily, but with visible reluctance and something like relief in her eyes. "Your Grace, Lady Cassandra, Miss Cromwell." Adrian's courtesy was impeccable, but Cass noticed his slight withdrawal, the way he'd positioned himself closer to her, as if using their engagement as a shield. "Bella has been so looking forward to this season," Lady Cromwell continued obliviously. "Though, of course, now that your Grace is engaged," she trailed off meaningfully, clearly fishing for details, or perhaps hoping for some indication the engagement might not be permanent. Cass felt a surge of sympathy for Arabella, who looked mortified by her mother's behaviour. "Miss Cromwell, that's a lovely gown. The colour suits you beautifully." Arabella's expression brightened with genuine pleasure. "Thank you, Lady Cassandra. I chose it myself. Mother wanted me in white, but I insisted on the blue." "Quite right. White is so insipid on most people. The blue brings out your eyes." They chatted for a few moments about fashion and the season, and Cass noticed Adrian watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When Lady Cromwell finally dragged her daughter away to meet other potential suitors, he leaned closer. "That was kind of you." She looked uncomfortable. "I remember what it was like being paraded around like livestock," Cass said quietly. "It's humiliating. Hence your sympathy for my earlier complaint about dancing." "Precisely." The evening continued with more of the same. Questions about their courtship, speculation about wedding plans, barely concealed envy from mothers whose daughters had hoped to snare the Duke. Through it all, Adrian remained at Cass's side, playing the devoted fiancé with skillful precision. In the carriage ride home, Adrian was quiet, staring out the window at the dark London streets. "You did well tonight," he said finally. "Very convincing." "As did you," Cass replied, "though I noticed you were particularly attentive when Lord Pemberton was asking detailed questions about our supposed first meeting. Pemberton is sharp. He was testing our story, looking for inconsistencies. I had to make sure our accounts matched." Adrian turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "We'll face more of that. People are curious, and some are suspicious. A duke suddenly engaged to a woman no one's heard of. It's unusual enough to invite speculation. Are you concerned they'll discover the truth? I'm concerned they'll ask questions we haven't prepared answers for. We should probably spend more time coordinating our story, making sure we know the same details." "Sounds thrilling," Cass said dryly. A hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "I promise to make it as painless as possible." When they arrived at Thornmere House, Adrian escorted her to her suite with the formal courtesy that had become their pattern. But at her door, he paused. "Cassandra," he said quietly, "thank you for tonight, for handling the interrogation with grace, for being kind to Miss Cromwell when you could have ignored her, for making this less unbearable than it might have been." "You're welcome," she managed, surprised by the genuine warmth in his tone. "Good night." "Good night, Adrian." After he left, Cass leaned against her closed door, and tried to ignore the flutter in her chest that his words had caused. This was dangerous territory. She couldn't afford to read meaning into basic courtesy, couldn't let herself imagine that his appreciation was anything more than relief that his fake fiancé wasn't making his life more difficult. But as she prepared for bed, she found herself replaying the evening, the way his hand had covered hers during dinner, the way he'd positioned himself protectively when Lady Cromwell had been invasive, the way he'd smiled when she'd been kind to Arabella. Stop it, she told herself. He's being civil because you're both stuck in this situation. Nothing more. But the warning felt increasingly hollow. The second week brought new challenges. They attended a ball at Lady Morrison's, where Adrian was obligated to dance with Cass multiple times. The first waltz was awkward. They were both trying too hard not to touch more than absolutely necessary. Relax, Adrian murmured as they moved through the steps. You're rigid as a board. I'm trying not to step on your feet. You're doing fine. Just follow my lead. By the third dance, something had shifted. The steps came more naturally, and Cass found herself actually enjoying the experience, despite her earlier reservations. Adrian was a skilled dancer, his guidance subtle but certain, and there was something oddly intimate about moving together in perfect synchronization. I thought you hated dancing, she said. I hate the performance aspect, he clarified. The actual physical activity is pleasant enough when one has a competent partner. Was that a compliment? An observation? You dance well. My father insisted I learn properly. He said it was essential for social success. He was right, unfortunately. Half of courtship happens on dance floors. They completed the waltz in companionable silence, and when the music ended, Adrian kept his hand at her waist, perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, before stepping back. Later that evening, as they stood together near the refreshment table, Lord Pemberton approached with a determined expression. Thornmere, might I borrow you for a moment? Parliamentary matter that requires discussion. Of course. Adrian glanced at Cass. Will you be all right alone for a few minutes? I'm perfectly capable of managing, she assured him. But she'd barely been alone 30 seconds when another gentleman approached, Lord Ashford, known for his libertine ways and wandering hands. He was handsome in a dissolute way, with the kind of charm that probably worked on susceptible young ladies. Lady Cassandra, he said, his smile too familiar. Alone at last. I've been hoping for an opportunity to become better acquainted. How kind, Cass said neutrally, taking a step back. The Duke is a fortunate man, though I must say, it's surprising to see him so taken with anyone. He's been resisting marriage quite successfully for years. Perhaps he simply hadn't met the right person. Or perhaps, Lord Ashford moved closer, invading her space. He's merely doing his duty while his heart lies elsewhere. Tell me, Lady Cassandra, are you truly content with the marriage of convenience? Wouldn't you prefer someone who appreciated you for reasons beyond family obligation? His hand reached for her waist, and Cass felt alarm spike through her. She stepped back again, but he followed, his smile turning predatory. I think you should leave, my lord, she said firmly. Come now. Don't be coy. The lady asked you to leave. Adrian's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He was suddenly there, positioning himself between Cass and Lord Ashford, with barely contained fury radiating from every line of his body. Thornmere, Ashford said with false heartiness. I was simply making conversation with your charming fiancé. You were making unwanted advances, Adrian corrected coldly. I suggest you find someone else to bother with your attention. My fiancé is not interested. I meant no offence. Then you should leave before offence is taken. The threat in Adrian's voice was unmistakable. Lord Ashford withdrew quickly, and Adrian turned to Cass with concern replacing anger. Are you all right? Did he touch you? I'm fine. He was just being persistent. Persistent. Adrian's jaw was tight. That's a generous interpretation of behaviour that bordered on assault. His hand came to rest at the small of her back. Protective. Possessive. Perhaps we should leave. We've barely been here 2 hours. People will talk if we leave early. People will talk anyway. And I'd rather endure gossip than subject you to more unwanted attention from men like Ashford, who see an unattended woman as fair game." The protective fury in his voice sent unexpected warmth. "Adrian, truly, I'm fine. I've dealt with worse than Lord Ashford's clumsy flirtation." "Boy, that doesn't make it acceptable." He was still watching her with concern that seemed genuine rather than performative. "If anyone else bothers you, tell me immediately. You shouldn't have to tolerate such behavior." "Is that the Duke speaking, or the fake fiancé?" "Both," he said simply. "You're under my protection, real or pretense. I take that seriously." They remained at the ball for another hour, but Adrian stayed close to Cass's side, his hand frequently at her waist or elbow, his attention focused on her rather than on the other guests. Several people remarked on how devoted he seemed, how attentive. In the carriage home, Adrian was uncharacteristically quiet. "You're brooding," Cass observed. "I'm thinking about Lord Ashford and men like him who think unmarried women are available for casual predation. It's not your responsibility to protect me from every rake in London." "Perhaps not," Adrian agreed, "but I find I'm rather protective of what's mine, even when it's temporary." The casual possessiveness in that statement should have annoyed her. Instead, it made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with awareness she was trying desperately to suppress. The third week brought a different kind of challenge. Cass received a letter from her mother's new physician, the one Beatrice had arranged, with remarkable news. The treatments were working. Her mother's condition was improving for the first time in years. Cass was reading the letter in the library late one afternoon when Adrian found her crying. "Cassandra, what's wrong?" She looked up, startled, hastily wiping tears. "Nothing. I'm sorry. I didn't hear you come in." "Clearly it's not nothing." He crossed to where she sat, concern evident in his expression. "What happened?" "It's my mother. The physician's letter." Her voice caught. "He says she's improving. Actually improving. Not just managing her pain, but genuinely getting better. I didn't think... I'd stopped hoping." "That's wonderful news," Adrian said gently. "Why are you crying?" "Because I'm so relieved I can barely breathe. Because 3 weeks ago I was watching her suffer and couldn't do anything about it. Because you and your mother gave us this chance when we had nothing left." Adrian sat beside her on the sofa, close but not quite touching. "You're saving your family, Cassandra. That's nothing to cry about. I'm crying because I'm grateful, and because I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for this to be taken away, for..." She trailed off, unable to articulate the constant fear that had become her companion. Without a word, Adrian pulled her into his arms. It was the first time he'd voluntarily touched her outside of public performances, and Cass stiffened with surprise before gradually relaxing against his chest. He held her carefully, one hand stroking her hair in a gesture of comfort rather than passion. "It's not going to be taken away," he murmured. "The arrangement stands regardless of what happens between us personally. Your mother's care, your brother's education, the money we agreed upon, all of that is guaranteed. You don't need to fear losing it." "Thank you," Cass whispered against his shoulder. They sat like that for several minutes, the library quiet around them, until Cass became aware of how perfectly she fit against him, how solid and warm he felt, how safe she felt in a way she hadn't felt in years. She pulled back quickly, putting distance between them. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to..." "Don't apologize for having emotions," Adrian said. "You've been carrying an enormous burden. You're entitled to occasionally break down. Still, it was inappropriate." "Was it?" He studied her with those penetrating grey eyes. "We're supposedly engaged, Cassandra. Engaged couples comfort each other. This was actually one of the more genuine interactions we've had." He was right, which made it more dangerous, not less. "I should go check on my mother, of course." But as she stood to leave, he caught her hand. "Cassandra, I'm glad your mother is improving. Genuinely glad. Not just because it fulfills our agreement, but because you deserve some relief from the constant worry." "Thank you, Adrian." That night in the library, their usual evening meeting place, had become routine over the past 3 weeks. The atmosphere felt different. charged somehow, weighted with awareness. Neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. "We should probably discuss our backstory more thoroughly," Adrian said, though his attention kept drifting from his book to where Cass sat across from him. "We're likely to face more detailed questions at upcoming events." "What do you want to know?" "Everything we supposedly shared during our courtship. Conversations, outings, private moments. If someone asks what we talked about during our rides in Hyde Park, what do I say?" Cass set down her book. "Philosophy and politics, probably. Those seem to be our only common interests." "Not our only interests," Adrian corrected. "We both enjoy reading. We're both practical rather than romantic. We both value honesty over social performance. Those are hardly the foundation for grand passion." "Who said anything about grand passion? Most successful marriages are built on compatibility and mutual respect, not theatrical romance." "Is that what you want? A marriage of compatibility?" "I want—" He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "This is a hypothetical conversation. We're not actually getting married." "Of course not," Cass agreed quickly, ignoring the odd disappointment that thought provoked. "I was simply curious about your views on marriage generally. Generally, I think most people approach it wrong. They pursue passion that inevitably fades and then find themselves trapped with someone they don't actually like. Better to start with friendship and compatibility. Passion, if it develops, is a bonus rather than the foundation. That's remarkably unromantic. I prefer realistic. Romance is lovely in poetry. In practice, it's often just unmet expectations and inevitable disappointment." Cass thought about that, about her own brief engagement years ago to a young man who'd promised eternal devotion and then disappeared the moment her family's money did. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps compatibility is undervalued. Speaking of compatibility, Adrian set his book aside entirely. "I've noticed we work well together at social events. We don't get in each other's way. We support each other's performances naturally. That's not common, you know. Most couples I observe are constantly stepping on each other metaphorically. Years of making do with limited resources makes one adaptable," Cass said. "I learned early not to waste energy on conflict when cooperation achieves better results. Practical to your core. Is that a criticism? An admiration?" His eyes held hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. "You're possibly the most sensible person I've ever met, Cassandra. It's actually rather extraordinary. Most men prefer less sensible women, more compliant. Most men are idiots who prefer women they can control rather than partners they can respect." The compliment, if it was a compliment, warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you, I think." "You're welcome." Now, about these fictitious Hyde Park rides. They spent the next hour constructing elaborate false memories, conversations they'd supposedly had about political philosophy, debates about social reform, quiet moments where they'd simply enjoyed each other's company without needing to fill silence with chatter. The exercise felt oddly intimate, creating a shared history that didn't exist, but somehow felt real in the telling. "We're quite good at this," Cass observed when they'd finished constructing their fictional courtship, "creating believable lies." "The best lies are built on truth," Adrian said. "We actually do have these conversations. We simply haven't had them on horseback in Hyde Park. Still deception. Still necessary." The fourth week brought their first real argument. Cass had been reorganizing some of the library shelves. They were in meticulous alphabetical order, but she thought a more logical, subject-based organization would be more efficient. She was deeply involved in moving philosophy texts when Adrian walked in and stopped dead. "What are you doing?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Improving the organization. I thought—" "You thought you'd rearranged my library without asking permission?" Cass bristled at his tone. "It's just books, Adrian, and the current system is inefficient. Philosophy scattered between 3 different shelves simply because of alphabetical order makes no sense when you could have all the epistemology together, all the ethics together. It's my library, my system, my books, which you offered to share with me. I offered to let you read them, not reorganize centuries of established order because you decided your way was better." They glared at each other, both breathing hard, until Cass felt her temper shift from anger to something else. Awareness that they were standing very close, that Adrian's eyes were blazing with fury that somehow made him even more attractive, that the tension between them wasn't entirely about books. "Fine," she said stiffly. "I'll put everything back exactly as it was. Thank you." His voice was still tight. "Though for the record, your system is still inefficient." "Noted." A hint of a smile tugged at his lips. "Anything else you'd like to criticize about my household management while you're at it?" "Your breakfast schedule is unnecessarily rigid. 8 o'clock precisely seems designed to torture people who prefer to sleep later. The servants need consistency. 8 o'clock works for the household routine. The household routine could be adjusted, not for the temporary convenience of a guest." The word guest stung more than it should have. "You're right, of course. I'm merely a temporary inconvenience. Pardon me for forgetting my place." She moved to sweep past him, but he caught her arm. "Cassandra, wait. That came out wrong. It came out exactly how you meant it." "No, it didn't." He was still holding her arm, his grip gentle but insistent. "You're not an inconvenience. This situation is complicated and I'm handling it badly. Let me go, Adrian. Not until you understand that I didn't mean to hurt you. Why do you care if you hurt me? This is business, remember? No expectations beyond public performances. Because despite everything, I find I do care." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as her. "You're not what I expected, Cassandra. You're sharp and practical, and you challenge me in ways I'm not accustomed to being challenged. And yes, reorganizing my library without permission annoyed me, but it also rather delighted me because it's exactly the kind of thing you would do. See an inefficiency and immediately move to fix it without worrying about whether you're overstepping." Cass stared at him, trying to process this unexpected speech. "I should have asked permission, probably, but I also should have been less territorial about books. They're just books. You don't believe that any more than I do." He laughed, and the tension between them shifted, still present, but different. Not anger now, but something more dangerous. They were standing very close, his hand still on her arm, and Cass could see the exact moment awareness flared in his eyes, and could feel the answering heat in her own response. "We should," she started. "Yes, we should," he agreed. Neither of them moved. "Cassandra!" Whatever he'd been about to say was interrupted by Beatrice sweeping into the library, with her usual impeccable timing. "There you both are. Excellent. I've just accepted an invitation on your behalf to Lady Thornbury's summer ball next week. It's the social event of the season. Absolutely everyone will be there. We'll need to prepare thoroughly. Cassandra, your ball gown from Madame Laurent should be ready by then." Adrian stepped back, putting proper distance between them, but his eyes held Cass's with an expression she couldn't quite read. Frustration, maybe, or relief at the interruption, or something else entirely. The moment was gone, but something had shifted between them. Something they were both trying very hard to pretend hadn't happened. Lady Thornbury's ball was indeed the social event of the season. The ballroom glittered with hundreds of candles, reflecting off jewels and silk gowns. Cass wore her new sapphire blue ball gown, the first truly beautiful dress she'd owned in years, and felt almost like her 18-year-old self again, before poverty and responsibility had worn away her capacity for simple enjoyment. Adrian had stared when she descended the stairs, and something in his expression had made her breath catch. "You look magnificent," he'd said quietly. "Madame Laurent's work, not mine. Madame Laurent provided the canvas. You're the art." The compliment had stayed with her all evening, warming her whenever she thought of it. The ball was exhausting, hours of dancing, conversation, performance. But it was also oddly enjoyable. Adrian was attentive without being suffocated, introducing her to important people, ensuring she was never left alone to face unwanted attention. They danced 4 times, which was pushing the edge of propriety, but acceptable for an engaged couple. During their final waltz of the evening, Cass felt something shift between them again. The steps came naturally now, their bodies moving together with practiced ease. Adrian held her slightly closer than strictly necessary, and she found herself leaning into him, enjoying the warmth and solid strength of him. "People are watching," she murmured. "Let them watch. We're supposed to be madly in love, remember? Are we being convincing?" "Extremely." His voice was low, intimate, almost too convincing. "What does that mean?" "It means—" He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "It means I'm finding it increasingly difficult to remember where the performance ends and reality begins." Cass's heart was suddenly pounding. "Adrian, I know what we agreed on. 3 months of pretense, then you leave. Nothing real, just business. But Cassandra, somewhere in the past 4 weeks, this stopped being just a pretense for me." "Don't!" She felt panic rising. "Don't say things you don't mean just because we've been playing roles for a month. I mean every word." His grey eyes were intense, serious. "I've been fighting it. God knows I've tried to maintain the boundaries we established. But I can't pretend anymore what I feel when I look at you, when I talk to you, when I hold you like... I can't pretend it's just performance. We've been living in close quarters, spending time together. It's natural to develop fondness. But that's not the same as... As what? Love." He guided her through a turn with practiced ease. "No, I'm not declaring love. I'm not that foolish. But I am admitting that I care for you beyond the terms of our arrangement, that I look forward to our evenings together, that I was genuinely concerned when Ashford bothered you, that I wanted to comfort you when you cried about your mother. None of that was performance. Adrian, we can't. This arrangement has clear terms. Terms can be renegotiated. To what end? You're a duke. I'm an impoverished lady whose entire current existence depends on your family's charity. Even if what you're feeling is real, which I'm not convinced it is, there's no future in it." His jaw tightened. "You think I care about your poverty? After everything we've shared these past weeks, you think I'm that shallow? I think you're caught up in proximity and pretense. I think in 2 more months when this arrangement ends and I'm no longer living in your house, no longer attending events at your side, you'll realize that what you felt was just the natural result of forced intimacy, not anything genuine or lasting. You're wrong." "Am I? How can either of us know? We've been playing roles, Adrian. We don't know what's real anymore." The music ended, and they were forced to separate. But as Adrian led her from the dance floor, his hand at her waist was possessive in a way that had nothing to do with performance. "This conversation isn't over," he said quietly. "Yes, it is. Because we have an agreement, and I'm not going to let temporary feelings, mine or yours, complicate what should remain simple. There's nothing simple about us, Cassandra. There never has been." The ride home was tense and silent. When they arrived at Thornmere House, Adrian walked her to her suite but paused at the door. "I meant what I said," he told her. "I'm not confused about my feelings, but I'll respect your need to maintain boundaries. I won't push, not until you're ready to admit you feel this too." "I don't." "You do. I see it in your eyes when you think I'm not looking. I feel it in the way you lean into me when we dance. You're just too afraid to admit it, because you think it's safer to leave in 2 months with your heart intact than risk staying and being hurt. You're arrogant." "I'm observant." He stepped closer, and Cass found herself backed against her door with nowhere to retreat. "And I'm patient. I can wait 2 more months. But I'm giving you fair warning, Cassandra. When this arrangement is supposed to end, I'm going to ask you to stay, not as my fake fiancé, but as my real one. And I hope to God you say yes." He left before she could formulate a response, and Cass stood frozen outside her door for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. This was exactly what she'd feared. Proximity and performance blurring into something that felt real but couldn't be trusted. Adrian thought he cared for her, but how could he know? They'd been living in an artificial situation, playing roles, creating false intimacy through forced proximity. And yet, she couldn't deny the warmth she felt when he smiled at her, the security she felt when he positioned himself protectively at her side, the intellectual stimulation of their conversations, the way her heart raced when he looked at her with those penetrating grey eyes. But feelings developed under false pretenses couldn't be trusted. Could they? She didn't know. And that uncertainty terrified her more than anything else. The fifth week brought a new crisis. Cass was taking tea with several ladies, part of the ongoing performance required to maintain the engagement fiction, when Lady Thornbury approached with a smile that made Cass's instincts scream warning. "Lady Cassandra," Lady Thornbury said sweetly, "how delightful to see you. I've been meaning to ask, you and the Duke met at the British Library, correct? Such a romantic story." "Yes," Cass replied cautiously. "How fascinating. Because I was speaking with my dear friend Lord Cambridge just yesterday, and he mentioned that the Duke was visiting his Cornwall estates throughout March. Wasn't that when you supposedly had your first meeting? March 15th, I believe you said." Cass felt ice slide down her spine. "Perhaps I misremembered the exact date." "Oh, I'm sure you simply confused the timing," Lady Thornbury interrupted, her smile sharpening. "Though it does seem odd, doesn't it, that the Duke would be in Cornwall while simultaneously courting you in London? Unless, of course—" She paused for dramatic effect. "The entire courtship story is a fabrication." Several nearby ladies gasped, leaning forward with avid interest. Cass felt her composure threatening to crack, but forced herself to remain calm. "I think you're mistaken about the Duke's travel schedule, Lady Thornbury. Perhaps you should ask him directly if you have questions about our courtship." "Oh, I intend to." Lady Thornbury's eyes gleamed with malicious pleasure. "I find this engagement quite suspicious, you know. A duke who's avoided marriage for years suddenly engaged to an impoverished nobody, and paying her mother's medical expense. It all seems rather convenient." "I beg your pardon." Cass felt her temper rising. "I'm simply suggesting that perhaps this engagement isn't quite what it appears. Perhaps it's an arrangement of some kind, financial transaction disguised as romance." The accusation hung in the air. Every lady present was watching avidly, and Cass knew this moment would define everything that followed. "You're suggesting I'm being paid to pretend to be engaged to the Duke?" Cass kept her voice level with effort. "That's an extraordinary accusation to make without evidence." "Is it? I've made some inquiries, Lady Cassandra. Your family's financial situation is dire. Suddenly, you're living in Thornmere House, with expensive new gowns, and your mother seeing the finest physicians in London. How is one to interpret such a dramatic change in circumstance as the natural result of my engagement to a duke who cares for his future wife and her family?" Cass replied, praying her voice didn't shake. "If you're implying something nefarious, I suggest you be very careful. Slander has consequences, Lady Thornbury." But even as she said it, Cass knew the damage was done. The whispers had started, spreading through the gathered ladies like fire through dry grass. By evening, all of London society would be questioning the legitimacy of her engagement. She left the tea as quickly as propriety allowed, and returned to Thornmere House to find Adrian and Beatrice already in an emergency conference in the study. "Lady Thornbury knows," Cass said, without preamble, "or suspects. She confronted me at Lady Morrison's tea with questions about the timeline of our supposed meeting. She knows you were in Cornwall in March, and she's apparently been investigating the financial arrangements." Adrian swore softly. "How much does she know?" "She suggested publicly that I'm being paid to pretend to be engaged to you. She has no definitive proof, but she has enough circumstantial evidence to create a scandal." "Then we need to act quickly," Beatrice said crisply, "before the rumours solidify into accepted truth." "How?" Cass asked. "She's right. The timeline doesn't work. The financial arrangements look suspicious, and we can't actually prove the engagement is real, because it isn't." "There's one way to prove it's real," Adrian said quietly. Both women turned to stare at him. "We are getting married," he continued. "Immediately. Not in 2 months as originally planned, but now. This week. Lady Thornbury can't claim a fake engagement if we're actually legally married." "That's insane," Cass protested. "Adrian, you can't seriously be suggesting—" "I'm completely serious." He moved toward her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Cassandra, I told you at the ball that I was going to ask you to make this real. I'm asking now, not because of Lady Thornbury's threats, but because I want you to stay. I want this marriage to be genuine. You're caught up in the moment. I'm caught up in you." His voice was low, urgent. I know you think this is just proximity and performance. I know you think I'll change my mind once the arrangement ends. But I won't. I've known for weeks now that what I feel for you is real. I enjoy your company. I admire your strength. I value your intelligence. I want to build something lasting with you. Tears were streaming down Cass's face. You don't know that. We've been living in an artificial situation. There's nothing artificial about the way I feel when you laugh at something I've said. Nothing manufactured about how much I enjoy our evening conversations. Nothing fake about wanting to kiss you every time you look at me with those intelligent eyes that see right through my ducal nonsense to who I actually am. Adrian, I love you, Cassandra. The words hung in the air between them. I didn't plan to. I fought it for weeks. But I love you. Completely. And I'm asking you to marry me. Not because we're trapped by Lady Thornbury's threats, but because I choose you. The question is, do you choose me? Cass looked at him. This man who'd been cold and hostile, and had somehow become everything, who'd arranged medical care for her mother without being asked, who'd protected her from unwanted attention at balls, who'd comforted her when she cried, who talked to her about philosophy and politics like her opinions actually mattered, who'd shown her that love didn't have to be a fairy tale to be real. I love you too, she whispered. I've been fighting it because I was so afraid it wasn't real. But it is, isn't it? This ridiculous, improbable, absolutely genuine thing between us. It's real, Adrian confirmed, pulling her into his arms. So will you marry me? For real this time? Yes. The word came out in a laugh that was half sob. Yes, I'll marry you. The kiss was inevitable and perfect. Not the chaste public kisses they'd performed at events, but something desperate and honest and absolutely real. When they finally broke apart, Beatrice was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Well, she said with satisfaction, that took longer than I expected, but the result is quite perfect. Now, shall we discuss wedding arrangement? I'm thinking special license, ceremony in 3 days. 3 days? Cass's head was spinning. The faster we marry, the faster we silence Lady Thornbury, Beatrice said practically. Besides, you two have been dancing around each other for 5 weeks. Might as well make it official before you combust from unresolved tension. Adrian laughed, and Cass felt the last of her resistance crumble. This was mad. Completely, utterly mad. But it was also right in a way she couldn't quite articulate. 3 days then, she agreed, though I reserve the right to be terrified. I'd be disappointed if you weren't, Adrian said, his arms still around her. I'm terrified too, but I'd rather be terrified with you than without you. The wedding was small. Immediate family in the Thornmere House chapel. 3 days later, as Beatrice had insisted. Cass wore a cream silk gown that Madame Laurent had commissioned. Simple but elegant, with lace at the sleeves and a train that pulled behind her beautifully. As she walked down the short aisle to where Adrian waited, she caught his expression and her breath caught. He looked nervous. The confident Duke of Thornmere was actually fidgeting with his cravat, his eyes never leaving her face. When she reached him, he leaned close enough to whisper, "You're beautiful, and I'm terrified." "So am I," she whispered back. "Good. At least we're equally terrified." The vows were traditional, but when Adrian slid the ring onto her finger, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that perfectly matched her ball gown, his hand trembled slightly. "I, Adrian James Blackwood, take thee, Cassandra Elizabeth Hartwell, to be my lawfully wedded wife." The words carried weight, promise, certainty that made Cass's throat tighten with emotion. When the vicar pronounced them married and Adrian kissed her, Cass felt something inside her finally settle. This was real. Against all odds, the arrangement that had started with deception had become something genuine. The wedding breakfast was joyful despite the rushed circumstances. Cass's mother, looking healthier than she had in years, thanks to months of proper medical care, cried happy tears. Thomas, home from his first term at Cambridge, made possible by the money from their arrangement, declared Adrian surprisingly decent for a duke actually. Even Beatrice looked misty-eyed, though she firmly denied it when Cass teased her about it. As the afternoon wore on, Adrian pulled Cass aside into a quiet corridor. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "Overwhelmed, happy, still slightly terrified." She looked up at him. "Is this really happening? 5 weeks ago I was hemming skirts in Cheapside. Now I'm a duchess married to a man I'm fairly certain I've been in love with since week 3 of our arrangement." "Week 3? Adrian raised his eyebrows. "That's earlier than I expected. I think I fell for you during our first real argument about the library reorganization. You were so stubborn and so certain you were right. It was infuriating and fascinating in equal measure. You fell in love with me because I annoyed you. I fell in love with you because you challenged me without fear, because you saw me as Adrian, not as the Duke, because you made me think and laugh and question my assumptions." He cupped her face tenderly. "Cassandra, I need you to know something. This marriage, I don't expect it to be perfect. We barely know each other in some ways. We'll probably argue and drive each other mad occasionally. That's a remarkably unromantic speech for our wedding day. I'm not finished." He pulled her closer. "What I'm trying to say is that I know we're starting this marriage under unusual circumstances, but I'm committed to making it work. To learn everything I don't know about you, to build something real and lasting with, if you're willing to try." Tears spilled down Cass's cheeks. "I'm willing, more than willing. I love you, Adrian, not because you have money or a title or because this marriage solves my problems. I love you because you're brilliant and passionate and kind when you let your guard down. Because you make me laugh and challenge my thinking and look at me like I'm the most fascinating person you've ever met." "You are," he said simply. "You absolutely are." They were supposed to depart for Adrian's Cornwall estate for a brief honeymoon, partly for tradition, partly to escape London's gossip for it. As they settled into the carriage, Cass leaned against Adrian's shoulder with a contentment she'd never expected to feel. "Did we just get married to escape a scandal?" she asked. "Technically, yes," Adrian replied, "though I prefer to think we got married because we love each other, and Lady Thornbury's threats simply provided convenient timing." "That's remarkably optimistic for you. You're a good influence on me." He kissed her forehead. "Ready for the next adventure, Duchess?" "As long as you're there," Cass said honestly. "I'm ready for anything." 3 years later, the nursery at Thornmere House was bathed in afternoon sunlight. Cassandra Blackwood, Duchess of Thornmere, stood by the window watching her husband attempt to change their 18-month-old daughter's nappy with the kind of intense concentration he usually reserved for parliamentary speech. "I think you've put it on backwards," Cass observed with amusement. "Impossible. I followed the procedure exactly as instructed." Adrian lifted their daughter Eleanor to examine his work, and she promptly grabbed his nose with sticky fingers. "Eleanor, darling, we've discussed this. Noses are not handles." Eleanor giggled and pulled harder. "Need assistance?" Cass asked. "Your daughter is a menace." "She's only my daughter when she's misbehaving," Cass reminded him. "When she's good, she's yours. She's never good. Ça va." But Adrian's tone was pure affection as he managed to extricate his nose and properly secure Eleanor's nappy. There, successfully changed without disaster. "Well done!" Cass moved to take Eleanor, who immediately snuggled against her shoulder with a contented sigh. "You're getting better at this. I've had excellent practice." Adrian wrapped his arms around both of them, and they stood together in comfortable silence, Eleanor dozing between them. It was a scene that would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. The cold, arrogant Duke playing a devoted father, the desperate, impoverished lady secure in her role as his wife and partner. "Do you ever think about how this started?" Cass asked quietly. "Your mother ambushing me at that garden party, the whole ridiculous arrangement." "Frequently," Adrian admitted. "Usually when I'm trying to explain to people how we met and have to remember which version of events we're currently maintaining. They'd eventually told the truth to close friends and family about Beatrice's scheme, the arrangement, how it had transformed into something real. Most people had been shocked but understanding. Lady Thornbury had been notably absent from their social circle ever since, her reputation damaged by her own malicious gossip when it became clear the marriage was genuine. "Do you regret any of it?" Cass asked. Adrian pulled back to look at her seriously. "Not a single moment." Yes, the circumstances were unusual. Yes, we were manipulated. But that manipulation brought you into my life. Everything that followed, falling in love, building this partnership, Eleanor, it's all because my mother decided to meddle spectacularly at a garden party. She's rather pleased with herself about it. She should be. Her scheming worked better than even she anticipated. He paused. Though if she tries to arrange marriages for Eleanor someday, we're putting a stop to it immediately. Agreed. Cass laughed. One generation of matchmaking chaos is quite enough. A knock at the nursery door announced Beatrice herself, looking delighted. There you are, she said. I have wonderful news. Your mother's physician sent word, Cassandra. The treatments have been so successful that he's recommending she reduce her care schedule significantly. She's genuinely well now, not just managing, but actually healthy. Tears sprang to Cass's eyes. 3 years of expensive treatment, made possible by Adrian's generosity and the financial security their marriage had provided, and her mother was finally, genuinely well. That's incredible. The physician also mentioned that your brother Thomas is graduating from Cambridge with highest honours, Beatrice continued. Top of his class in mathematics. Several excellent positions have been offered. He wrote to tell us, Adrian said with pride. We're attending his graduation ceremony next month. Later, after Beatrice had departed and Eleanor was tucked into her crib, Adrian and Cass found themselves in the library, still their favourite room, still where they spent their quiet evenings together. 3 years, Cass said, settling into her familiar chair with a book. We've been married 3 years. Best 3 years of my life, Adrian replied from his chair across from her. Though I'll admit the first few weeks of our arrangement when you were torturing me with proximity while insisting we maintain boundaries were fairly miserable. I was being sensible. You were being stubborn. Same thing. He laughed and crossed to pull her from her chair into his lap, making her squeak with surprise. I love you, he said seriously. I know I don't say it enough because I'm English and emotionally repressed, but I do. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, even if you came into my life through my mother's meddling. I love you too, Cass said, settling comfortably against his chest. And while we're being honest, I knew I was in love with you by week 4 of the arrangement, possibly earlier. I just fought it because I was terrified. Week 4? Adrian's eyebrows rose. You said week 3 before. I was being conservative, trying to preserve some dignity. Cassandra. She kissed him before he could protest further, and the conversation dissolved into the kind of comfortable intimacy that came from 3 years of marriage, built on a foundation of honesty, respect, and love that had survived despite its ridiculous beginning. When they finally returned to their reading, Cass thought about the impoverished lady who'd been reorganizing glassware at a garden party 3 years ago, desperate and alone, and convinced her only value was in being useful. That woman had agreed to pretend to be a duchess for one afternoon in exchange for money. What she'd gotten instead was a real partnership with a man who challenged and supported her in equal measure. A daughter who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. Financial security that meant her family would never struggle again. A purpose beyond mere survival. And love. Complicated, improbable, absolutely genuine love that had started with deception and transformed into the most honest thing in her life. What are you thinking about? Adrian asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Fairy tales. You? Thinking about fairy tales? How uncharacteristically romantic. Not traditional ones. The real kind. She smiled at him. The ones that start with desperate circumstances and ridiculous arrangements and transform into something extraordinary through sheer stubborn determination to make it work. Is that what we are? A fairy tale? The best kind, Cass said. The true kind. Adrian pulled her closer, and they sat together as the afternoon light faded, reading companionably and occasionally glancing at each other with the kind of contentment that came from knowing they'd found something rare and precious. Love built not despite their unusual beginning, but perhaps because of it. And somewhere in another room, Beatrice smiled to herself, already contemplating which eligible young ladies might make suitable matches for the various young gentlemen she'd been observing at recent social events. After all, her spectacular success with Adrian and Cassandra had proven that sometimes a little well-intentioned meddling could produce wonderful results. Though if either Adrian or Cassandra had known what she was planning, they would have stopped her immediately. Some things, they'd learned, were better left to discover naturally. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this unexpected romance. If this story made you smile, touched your heart, or reminded you that love can bloom in the most surprising circumstances, please show your support by liking, commenting, and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement keeps these stories alive and helps them reach more people who need a little romance and hope in their lives. And before you go, tell us in the comments, would you have agreed to Beatrice's outrageous proposal? We love hearing from you. Another sweeping historical tale is waiting for you next. Until then, may you find love in the most unexpected places.